The city thrived under the shimmer of endless skyscrapers and the glow of streetlights, a testament to ambition and affluence. Among the hustle and bustle of the urban elite was Alexander Carlisle, a billionaire in his mid-40s. Renowned for his sharp intellect, Alexander had built an empire of unparalleled success. Yet behind the polished facade and power was a man burdened by the relentless expectations of his social circle. That evening, Alexander stood in his penthouse. The city stretched out like a living canvas below him. Tonight was the annual charity gala, a gathering of the city's most influential figures, all eager to parade their wealth and charm. But Alexander had grown weary of the routine, the shallow conversations, the predictable gossip, and most of all, the prying questions about his personal life. Since his very public split from a Hollywood starlet, the tabloids had been relentless. His every move was dissected, and speculation about his next romantic partner had reached a fever pitch. Alexander wasn't just looking for a date, he needed a statement. Someone who would turn heads and silence the whispers. And he had an idea. Leaving the luxury of his penthouse, Alexander ventured into the bustling streets below. As he strolled past the glowing storefronts and hurried commuters, his gaze swept over the sea of faces. That's when he saw her. She was seated on the cold concrete, her tattered coat pulled tightly around her frame, her hair a wild cascade obscuring her face. Unlike the hurried crowds that passed her without a glance, Alexander paused. There was something about her posture, straight, resilient despite the hardships that were evident in her worn clothes. Her hands clutched a faded book, her fingers smudged with dirt, yet there was an air of quiet dignity about her. He approached slowly, his leather shoes tapping against the pavement. She looked up, startled, her piercing gray eyes meeting his. They were guarded, weary from a life of struggle, but they carried a spark of intelligence that intrigued him. "Excuse me," Alexander said, his tone gentle yet commanding. "I have an unusual proposition for you." The woman's gaze narrowed, suspicion flickering across her features. "What kind of proposition?" "I need a date for an event tonight," he explained. "A formal gala. You'll be compensated for your time." Her lips tightened and she turned her gaze away. "Is this some kind of joke?" she muttered. "No joke," Alexander replied sincerely. "I assure you I'm serious. Just a few hours of your time, and you'll be paid handsomely." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. "How much?" $5,000, he said without hesitation. "Tonight only." Her breath hitched, and for a moment she seemed to falter. Then she straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "Why me?" "Because you're different," Alexander said simply. "You don't belong to the world I'm used to, and that's exactly what I need." She hesitated, her fingers brushing the frayed hem of her coat. "All right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll do it." Alexander extended a hand. "Alexander Carlisle." She regarded him for a beat before shaking his hand. "Emma," she replied quietly. Moments later, they were seated in Alexander's sleek black car, its interior gleaming with polished leather and chrome. Emma sat stiffly, her hands clutching the edge of her seat, her gaze flitting nervously between him and the passing cityscape. The luxury was foreign to her, and it showed. The car pulled up in front of a high-end boutique where a team of stylists waited. Emma's brow furrowed as she glanced at him. "What is this?" If you're gonna be my date, you need to look the part," Alexander said with a reassuring smile. "Trust me." Reluctantly, she followed the stylists inside, where they whisked her away into a private dressing room. Emma watched in awe as they worked their magic. Her tangled hair was transformed into soft waves that framed her face, and the grime of the streets was gently wiped away, revealing smooth, radiant skin. When they brought out the gown, a deep emerald green that clung to her figure elegantly, she hesitated. "Is this really necessary?" she murmured. "It is," one of the stylists replied with a kind smile. "You'll see." When Emma finally stepped out, Alexander's breath caught. She looked stunning, the gown accentuating her natural beauty while retaining a sense of simplicity that set her apart. Her gaze was uncertain, her hands fidgeting with the fabric. "You look incredible," Alexander said, his voice sincere. Emma's cheeks flushed and she glanced away. "Let's just get this over with." As they arrived at the grand venue, Emma felt her anxiety spike. The opulence of the gala was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers hung overhead, their light scattering across the marble floors, while elegantly dressed guests mingled and sipped champagne. Alexander placed a steady hand on the small of her back, guiding her inside. Whispers erupted as they entered, all eyes on the mysterious woman at Alexander's side. Emma clung to his arm, her voice barely audible. "They're all staring." "Let 'em," Alexander said with a small smile. "You belong here." Emma wasn't so sure, but as the evening progressed, she began to relax. Her natural wit and candor shone through in conversations, earning her the admiration of many guests. Alexander watched in awe as she held her own, her honesty and warmth cutting through the superficial pleasantries of the elite. "She's enchanting," one guest remarked to Alexander, their tone tinged with surprise. "She's extraordinary," Alexander replied, his gaze never leaving Emma. By the time the evening drew to a close, Alexander realized he was no longer playing a role. His admiration for Emma had grown into something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. But the night wasn't over yet, and Alexander had a plan, a bold move that would change both their lives forever. Emma's heart raced as she glanced around the glittering ballroom, her thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief. She never imagined herself in a place like this, mingling with the wealthy and influential, her arm linked with that of a man who seemed to command every gaze in the room. Yet here she was, an invisible woman suddenly thrust into the center of attention. As Alexander guided her toward a quieter corner of the room, she couldn't shake the nagging thought. What am I even doing here? This world was his, not hers. The polished surfaces, the shallow pleasantries. It all felt foreign and suffocating. She had agreed to this on a whim, a desperate decision made in the face of circumstances that had left her with few options. But now, standing among chandeliers and silk-clad socialites, doubt crept in. "Are you all right?" Alexander's voice was low, his concern evident as he studied her face. Emma forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a little overwhelmed." "You're doing great," he said, his tone reassuring. "Better than great, actually. You've already won over half the room." Emma let out a shaky laugh. "That's because they don't know who I really am." Alexander's expression softened, and for the first time that night he reached for her hand. The gesture caught her off guard, but she didn't pull away. "Maybe it's because they see what I see," he said quietly. "Someone genuine." Before Emma could respond, a woman approached them, her elegant gown flowing behind her like liquid gold. Her striking features and confident smile were matched only by the cool appraisal in her eyes. "Alexander," she purred, her voice dripping with familiarity. "It's been ages." "Lydia," Alexander said smoothly, though there was a hint of tension in his tone. "It has." "And who is this?" Lydia's gaze shifted to Emma, her smile sharpening. "This is Emma," Alexander said, his voice steady. "She's with me." Lydia's eyes lingered on Emma for a moment longer than necessary, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. "Charmed," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "You must tell me where you found her, Alexander. Such unique company." Emma felt her cheeks flush, a mix of embarrassment and anger rising in her chest. Before she could speak, Alexander stepped in. "Actually, Lydia," he said, his tone cool, "Emma and I met under rather extraordinary circumstances. But then, extraordinary people often have..." The subtle barb in his words wasn't lost on Lydia, whose smile faltered ever so slightly. "Of course," she said, her tone clipped. "Well, it's always a pleasure catching up, Alexander. Enjoy your evening." As Lydia swept away, Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "She hates me," she muttered. "She doesn't even know you," Alexander replied, his hand still lightly resting on hers. "And if she did, She'd be the one feeling inadequate. Emma gave him a skeptical look. You really think so? I know so, he said firmly. You're stronger than anyone in this room, Emma. Don't let them make you feel otherwise. Despite herself, Emma felt a flicker of warmth at his words. She wasn't sure she believed him, but the sincerity in his voice was hard to ignore. The evening wore on, and Emma found herself gradually easing into her role. She even managed to laugh at a few of Alexander's wry observations about the guests, her initial discomfort giving way to a tentative sense of confidence. But just as she began to feel like she might survive the night, the evening took an unexpected turn. A man approached their table, his expression one of polite curiosity. He was older, with graying hair and a tailored suit that spoke of quiet wealth. Alexander, he said with a warm smile, it's good to see you. Mr. Fitzroy, Alexander said, rising to shake the man's hand. A pleasure, as always. The man's gaze shifted to Emma, his smile never wavering. And who might this charming young lady be? This is Emma, Alexander said, his tone calm but deliberate. My fiancée. Emma's breath caught, her mind reeling. What did he just say? Mr. Fitzroy's smile widened. Well, isn't that wonderful? Congratulations to you both. Emma managed a weak smile, her thoughts racing. As soon as the man walked away, she turned to Alexander, her voice low but urgent. Fiancé? Relax, he murmured. It's just a harmless embellishment. Fitzroy's a gossip. He'll spread the word, and by the end of the night, no one will question why you're here with me. But, Emma began, only to be interrupted by the sound of a microphone tapping. The room quieted as an announcer stepped onto the stage, signaling the start of the evening's main event, the charity auction. Alexander leaned in, his voice low. Just play along for a little while longer. I promise, everything will be fine. Emma bit her lip, her nerves frayed. She wasn't sure what game Alexander was playing, but she wasn't sure she wanted to be a part of it anymore. As the auction progressed, Emma found herself drawn into the spectacle. Lavish items were paraded across the stage, from rare art pieces to luxury vacations, each fetching astronomical sums. Alexander bid on a few items, his casual demeanor in stark contrast to the cutthroat competition around him. But when a particular item was unveiled, a custom-designed necklace adorned with emeralds and diamonds, Emma noticed something shift in him. Going once, going twice, the auctioneer began. 200,000, Alexander called out, his voice calm. Emma's jaw dropped. You can't be serious. Alexander turned to her, his expression unreadable. Why not? It's for a good cause. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a resounding thud. Sold! As applause rippled through the room, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Alexander's bid had been about more than charity. There was something in the way he looked at her, a quiet intensity that made her heart race. Later, as they prepared to leave, Alexander handed the necklace to her without ceremony. Here, he said, it suits you. Emma stared at him, stunned. I can't accept this. You can, he said firmly. And you will. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the intricate design. Why are you doing this? Alexander met her gaze, his eyes steady. Because you deserve it. For the first time in years, Emma felt the sting of tears behind her eyes. She turned away, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't name. As the car sped through the city, Emma sat in silence, the necklace resting in her lap. She couldn't make sense of the night's events, Alexander's generosity, his strange protectiveness, the way he had defended her against people like Lydia. It was as if he saw something in her that even she couldn't see. When they finally arrived back at his penthouse, Emma hesitated in the doorway. I should go, she said quietly. Stay, Alexander said, his voice soft. Just for a little while. I'll have the driver take you wherever you need to go later. Emma hesitated, her gaze searching his. She didn't trust easily, but there was something about Alexander, something genuine, that made her want to believe him. Finally, she nodded. As they stepped inside, Alexander poured them each a glass of wine and led her to the balcony. The city stretched out before them, a sea of lights and endless possibilities. "You're not what I expected," Emma said after a long silence. "Neither are you," Alexander replied with a small smile. For the first time that night, Emma allowed herself to relax. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't such a bad idea after all. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the city, painting the skyline with hues of orange and pink. Emma stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse, clutching a warm mug of tea. The previous night felt surreal, a whirlwind of emotions and events she could barely piece together. The emerald necklace rested on a nearby table, its sparkle muted in the soft morning light. She had wanted to leave hours ago, but Alexander's unexpected kindness and the strange sense of safety she felt in his presence had stopped her. "Sleep well?" His voice startled her. She turned to find Alexander, his suit jacket draped over one arm, already dressed for the day. "I've had worse nights," she admitted, her tone cautious. Alexander gave a small smile. "Good, I thought we'd talk before you go." Emma raised an eyebrow, wary. "About what?" "About why you're running," he said simply. The question hit harder than she expected. "I'm not running," she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm surviving." Alexander crossed the room, placing his jacket on the back of a chair. "Surviving is one thing, Emma. Hiding is another." Her gaze dropped to the floor, her defenses rising. "Why do you care? You don't even know me." "You're right," he said. "I don't, but I want to." Emma looked at him, searching for any sign of mockery or ulterior motives, but his expression was earnest. For a moment, she considered opening up, but the scars of her past held her back. "It doesn't matter," she said finally. "Last night was a job, not an invitation to share my life story." Alexander nodded, as if he'd expected her response. "Fair enough, but if you ever change your mind, the offer stands." Emma didn't respond, but something about his words lingered. Later that day, Emma found herself back on the streets, the bustling city a sharp contrast to the quiet luxury of Alexander's world. She had tucked the necklace into her bag, unsure of what to do with it. It was worth more than she could fathom, but selling it felt wrong. It wasn't hers, at least not in a way that felt real. As she walked through the crowded streets, lost in thought, a voice called out to her. "Emma?" She froze, her heart racing. Turning slowly, she saw a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, with unkempt hair and a weathered face, his eyes filled with a mix of surprise and relief. "Jake," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake stepped closer, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket. "It's been months. I thought you were gone." Emma swallowed hard, guilt tightening her chest. "I didn't mean to disappear," she said. "Things just happened." "Thanks?" Jake's voice was laced with bitterness. "You vanished, Emma. No note, no goodbye. Do you have any idea what that was like for me?" Emma looked away, her throat tight. "I'm sorry." Jake exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You're sorry? Great. That makes everything better." "I didn't have a choice," she said quietly. "I was barely holding on." "And you think I wasn't?" Jake shot back. "We were supposed to get through this together, Emma. But you left. You gave up on us." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. "I didn't give up," she said, her voice trembling. "I was trying to survive." Jake stared at her for a long moment, his anger slowly giving way to something softer. "You look different," he said finally. "Better, I guess." Emma let out a bitter laugh. "Temporary. Just like everything else." Jake frowned, but before he could respond, Emma's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, surprised to see Alexander's name on the screen. She hesitated, then answered. "Emma." Alexander's voice was calm but urgent. "Can you meet me at the Carlisle Foundation offices? I need your help with something." "My help?" she asked, confused. "Yes," he said simply. "I'll explain when you get here." Emma glanced at Jake, who was watching her with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "I have to go," she said, her voice tight. Jake's expression hardened. Of course you do. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, she turned and walked away, leaving Jake behind once again. The Carlisle Foundation offices were a stark contrast to the penthouse. Though still luxurious, the space was designed with purpose. Open, efficient, and buzzing with activity. Emma felt out of place as she stepped inside, her worn boots squeaking slightly against the polished floors. "Emma," Alexander greeted her, his tone lighter than it had been that morning. "Thank you for coming." "What's going on?" she asked, her unease growing. "I have a meeting with some board members," he explained. "We're launching a new initiative to support homeless shelters and rehabilitation programs. I thought your perspective might be valuable." Emma blinked, caught off guard. "My perspective?" Alexander nodded. "You know better than anyone what it's like to be in that position. I think the board could learn a lot from you." Emma stared at him, unsure whether to be flattered or offended. "You're serious?" "Completely," he said. "But if you're not comfortable, I understand." Emma hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run. But then she thought of Jake's words, the accusation in his voice. "You gave up on us." Maybe this was her chance to prove him wrong. "I'll do it," she said finally. Alexander's smile was genuine. "Thank you." The meeting was unlike anything Emma had ever experienced. The board members, a mix of polished professionals and philanthropic powerhouses, listened intently as she spoke about her experiences. At first, she stumbled over her words, her nerves threatening to get the better of her. But as she continued, her confidence grew. "You can't just throw money at the problem," she said, her voice steady. "You need to address the root causes: mental health, addiction, lack of affordable housing, and you need to treat people with dignity. It's not just about giving them a place to sleep, it's about giving them hope." When she finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, one of the board members, a woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile, spoke up. "That was enlightening," she said. "Thank you, miss." "Emma," she said quickly, "just Emma." The woman nodded. "Thank you, Emma. Your insights are invaluable." As the meeting adjourned, Alexander approached her. "You were amazing," he said. Emma shrugged, though she couldn't hide the small smile that tugged at her lips. "I just told the truth." "Exactly," Alexander said. "That's what makes you different." Emma met his gaze, her heart skipping a beat. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a burden or a failure, but as someone who mattered. That evening, as Emma walked home, she replayed the day's events in her mind. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But hope, she knew, was a fragile thing, and in a city like this, it didn't take much to snuff it out. Emma's steps echoed down the dimly lit streets, the city buzzing with its usual chaos as she returned to the small shelter she had called home for the past few months. The contrast between her current surroundings and the day's events struck her harder than ever. The Carlisle Foundation offices, the polished board members, and even Alexander himself. Everything about them seemed like a dream she was only visiting. All of an old whist-formed fighting back against a tremendous opponent. She couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. The weight of the emerald necklace in her bag reminded her of the widening gap between her and the world Alexander lived in. Despite his assurances, a lingering doubt gnawed at her. Could someone like her ever truly fit into his life? Her thoughts were interrupted as she turned a corner and heard voices, a heated argument spilling out of the alleyway near the shelter. Emma froze, her instincts honed from years of living on the edge kicking in. She pressed herself against the wall, her breath shallow, as the words became clearer. "You promised us another cut," a rough voice barked. "Now you're backing out?" A second voice, calmer but no less menacing, replied, "We're done here. You got what you were owed." The first voice snarled, "Not good enough." Emma peeked around the corner, her pulse quickening as she spotted two men, one holding a metal pipe and the other standing stiffly with his hands in his pockets. The air crackled with tension. "Hey!" a third voice called, and Emma's heart sank. She recognized Jake instantly as he stepped into view, his posture defensive, What's going on here? This doesn't concern you, the man with the pipe snapped. It does if you're causing trouble near the shelter, Jake replied firmly. Emma's grip tightened on her bag as she watched the standoff unfold. She wanted to step in, but what could she do? Jake had always been the protector, the one who stood up when others backed down. But this wasn't a fight he could win alone. Before she could second-guess herself, Emma stepped into the alley. "Jake!" she called, her voice trembling but loud enough to draw attention. All three men turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. "Emma? What are you doing here?" She hesitated, suddenly acutely aware of the danger. "I was looking for you." Jake's brow furrowed. "This isn't the time." The man with the pipe interrupted, taking a step toward her. "You know him?" Emma forced herself to stand tall, despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Yes, and I think it's time you left." The man laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." "Enough," the second man said, his tone sharp. "We're done here." Without another word, the two men disappeared into the shadows, leaving Emma and Jake alone in the alley. The tension lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. "What were you thinking?" Jake demanded, his voice a mix of anger and concern. "You could have gotten yourself hurt." Emma crossed her arms, trying to mask her lingering fear. "I wasn't going to let them hurt you." Jake shook his head, his frustration evident. "You don't have to play hero, Emma. You've already made your choice. You walked away." The words stung, but Emma refused to back down. "That doesn't mean I don't care." Jake's expression softened, but the pain in his eyes remained. "You care, huh? Then why did you leave? Why didn't you tell me what was going on?" Emma hesitated, the weight of her past decisions pressing down on her. "Because I didn't want you to see me like that," she admitted quietly. "I didn't want to drag you down with me." Jake let out a bitter laugh. "And instead you let me think you were gone for good." Emma looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're always sorry, Emma. But sorry doesn't change anything." They stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the city filling the void. Finally, Jake spoke again, his voice softer. "So, what now? Are you staying? Or are you just passing through?" Emma hesitated. The truth was, she didn't know. Alexander's offer, the opportunities he seemed to open up for her, it all felt like a lifeline. But Jake was her past, the one constant in a world that had always felt unstable. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I want to make things right." Jake nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Then start by being honest, not just with me, with yourself." Emma swallowed hard, his words striking a chord she couldn't ignore. The next morning, Emma stood outside Alexander's office building, her stomach twisting with nerves. She hadn't planned to come, but something about Jake's words had pushed her here. She needed clarity, answers. Not just about Alexander, but about herself. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "Mr. Carlisle is in a meeting, but he should be free shortly. Would you like to wait?" Emma nodded, taking a seat in the sleek, modern lobby. Her thoughts swirled as she tried to piece together what she wanted to say. She had spent so long surviving that the idea of asking for more, of reaching for something better, felt foreign. When Alexander finally appeared, he looked surprised but not displeased to see her. "Emma," he said, his tone warm, "this is a nice surprise. What brings you here?" She stood, clutching her bag tightly. "I need to talk to you." He gestured toward a nearby conference room. "Of course. Let's go somewhere private." Once inside, Emma hesitated, the words she had rehearsed suddenly feeling inadequate. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do what?" Alexander asked gently. "Trust," she said, meeting his gaze. "Believe that someone like you would want to help someone like me." Alexander's expression softened and he stepped closer. "Emma, you're not just someone. You're extra." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I'm broken, Alexander. I've spent my whole life just trying to survive. I don't know how to be anything else." He reached out, his hand brushing hers. "Maybe it's time you stopped surviving and started living." Emma stared at him, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope, a fragile, tentative belief that maybe, just maybe, she deserved more. "Will you let me help you?" Alexander asked, his voice steady. Emma hesitated, the weight of her fears and doubts pressing down on her. But then she thought of Jake's words, of the moments of kindness Alexander had shown her, and she nodded. "Yes," she said softly, "but I'm not sure I know how." Alexander smiled, his eyes warm. "That's okay. We'll figure it out together." As they stood there, the city bustling beyond the windows, Emma realized that her life was no longer defined by the streets she had walked or the battles she had fought. For the first time, she saw a path forward, uncertain, yes, but filled with possibility. And for the first time, she dared to hope. The days that followed marked a strange and transformative period for Emma. Alexander's insistence on helping her wasn't just empty words. He introduced her to people within his network, mentors, counselors, and advocates who worked in rehabilitation and social reintegration programs. At first, Emma felt like an outsider, awkward and self-conscious in their presence. But slowly, she began to realize that their support was genuine. Healthcare professionally, despite what she was watching everywhere around her, it was the response and their transformative period programs that really pushed her over. One afternoon, Alexander invited her to a lunch meeting with a woman named Margaret Daniels, a former social worker who now ran a successful nonprofit focused on workforce development for underprivileged communities. Margaret was in her late 50s, her salt and pepper hair pulled back in a sleek bun. Her warm smile put Emma at ease, but her sharp gaze hinted at a no-nonsense attitude. "I hear you have a lot to say about what really helps people on the margins," Margaret said, folding her hands neatly on the table. "Alexander has been singing your praises." Emma glanced nervously at Alexander, who gave her an encouraging nod. "I don't know about that," she said hesitantly. I've been through some things, that's all." "Sometimes, the people who've been through the most have the clearest insight," Margaret replied. "Tell me, Emma, what would you change if you could?" Emma thought for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her glass. I think people need to feel seen," she said slowly. "It's not just about housing or food, though those things matter. It's about knowing someone cares enough to really look at you, to see you as more than your circumstances." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "That's an important perspective. We spend so much time addressing symptoms, we often overlook the human side of things." As their conversation continued, Emma found herself opening up in ways she hadn't anticipated. She talked about the struggles of living on the streets, the stigma that followed her like a shadow, and the small acts of kindness that had kept her going. Margaret listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. By the end of the lunch, Margaret was smiling. "You're remarkable, Emma," she said. "Have you ever thought about sharing your story more widely? You could inspire a lot of people." Emma flushed, the idea both terrifying and strangely appealing. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm not sure anyone would care." "I think you'd be surprised," Margaret said. "And if you ever decide to try, I'd be happy to help." As they parted ways, Emma couldn't shake the sense that something profound had shifted within her. For so long, she had seen herself as invisible, unworthy of attention or recognition. But now, people like Alexander and Margaret were challenging that belief, and she wasn't sure what to do with the hope they were offering. That evening, Emma found herself walking through a quiet park, the cool breeze rustling the trees overhead. She had needed some time to think, to process everything that had happened over the past week. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions and doubts, but beneath it all was a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. As she sat on a bench staring out at the pond, she heard footsteps approaching. Glancing up, she saw Alexander, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "You're not an easy person to track down," he said with a small smile. Emma raised an eyebrow. How did you know I'd be here? I didn't, he admitted, sitting down beside her. I just got lucky. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the city fading into the background. Finally, Alexander spoke. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about being seen. Emma glanced at him, curious. What about it? I think you're right, he said. People need to feel like they matter, like their stories are worth telling. Emma hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. I'm not sure my story's worth much. I disagree, Alexander said firmly. Your story has power, Emma. It's not just about where you've been, it's about where you're going, and I think you have the potential to change lives. Emma looked at him, her heart pounding. You really believe that? I do, he said, his voice steady. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of other people would too. For the first time, Emma allowed herself to consider the possibility. Maybe she could be more than the sum of her hardships. Maybe her experiences could mean something, not just to her, but to others. I don't know where to start, she admitted. Alexander smiled. You've already started. The rest will come. Over the next few weeks, Emma threw herself into the opportunities Alexander had opened for her. She attended workshops, met with mentors, and even began volunteering at a local shelter. Slowly but surely, she began to feel a sense of purpose, a connection to something greater than herself. But the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, times when she questioned whether she was truly capable of building a new life. And then there was Jake, whose presence loomed in her mind like a shadow. One evening, she decided to visit him. The shelter was quiet when she arrived, the faint hum of the television in the common room the only sound. Jake was sitting at a table, a deck of cards spread out in front of him. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. Hey, she said softly. Hey, he replied, his tone guarded. Emma sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. About being honest. Jake raised an eyebrow. And you're right, she said. I wasn't honest with you, or with myself. But I'm trying to change that. Jake studied her for a moment before nodding. I can see that. Emma hesitated, then reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. I don't know if I can make up for the past, she said, but I want to try. Jake's expression softened, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled. That's all I needed to hear. As they sat together, the weight of the past began to lift, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of hope. Emma's journey was far from over, but for the first time she felt like she was on the right path. With Alexander's support, Margaret's guidance, and Jake's forgiveness, she began to rebuild her life, one step at a time. And as she stood on the cusp of a new beginning, she realized that the greatest change wasn't in her circumstances, it was in herself. For the first time, she believed she was worthy of the future she was fighting for. And that made all the difference. Enjoyed this story? Watch the next video for another great one, and be sure to subscribe for more exciting tales.